Okay. Okay. So we're ready now to begin the Gardena City Council and Planning and Environmental Quality Commission special meeting and workshop notice and agenda for Tuesday, June 1st, 2021 at 7:05 p.m. Let me just read this before we do roll call here. In order to minimize the spread of the COVID-19 virus, Governor Newsom has issued executive orders that temporarily suspends the requirements of the Brown Act. Please be advised that the council chambers are closed to the public and that some or all of the Gardena City Council members and Planning Commissioner meeting members may be attending this meeting telephonically. If you would like to participate in the meeting, you can participate via the following options. The first way is join the Zoom meeting via the internet or via phone conference. The direct URL is https://us0.2web.zom.us/I/895-9697-0766. The meeting ID number is 895-9697-0766. The telephone number is area code 669-900-9128. And if you wish to speak live on a specific agenda item during the meeting, you may use the raise your hand feature during the item you wish to speak on. Members of the public wishing to address the City Council or Planning and Environmental Quality Commission will be given 3 minutes to speak. The City of Gardena thanks you in advance for helping us take all the precautions to prevent the spreading of the COVID-19 virus. I'd also like to remind everybody who's on the panel, if you can make sure you mute your phones. And if you're not speaking, if you can mute your mic so that it doesn't interrupt the presentation. So let's begin with the roll call. Madam City Clerk, will you do the roll call, please?
Mayor Serta.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Tanaka.
Here.
Councilmember Francis. Councilmember Henderson.
Here.
Councilmember Cascanian.
Present.
Planning Commission Chair Stephen Langley.
Here.
Vice Chair Daryl Henderson.
Present.
Commissioner Sherman.
Present.
Commissioner Pierce.
Present.
That concludes our roll call, Madam Mayor.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we're going to move on to the workshop, and I'd like to turn it over to, I believe it's Greg or Amanda at this time.
Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so welcome to the next workshop for the housing element. We're going to have 2 portions of this presentation today, both of them focusing on the time period of 2021 to 2029, which is the time period for the next housing element. The first section will be going over goals, policies, and programs. These will be new presentation given by our consultant, Veronica Tam. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll go over for the last time, the sites inventory update. And we'll show you all of the changes that have been made after Planning Commission and City Council meeting and a few additional changes the staff have made. So let's launch into the goals, policies, and programs portion. So Veronica, you're on.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. Like just Greg mentioned, I'd like to go over some the housing element goals, policies, and programs tonight. And our intent is not to significantly revise the city's goals and policies relating to housing element, but make the tweaks that is necessary. Regarding programs, we're going to go over what are the mandatory programs that we have to include in the housing element. The first goal of the housing element should still be really focusing on maintaining and enhancing the quality and stability of the city's residential neighborhoods. We're not recommending any policy change to this goal at all. So the focus really is on upkeep, maintenance, and assisting households with making rehabilitation assistance. Next slide. The next goal relates more to the production of housing, but facilitating housing development for people with special needs. That's a requirement of housing element law, and as we have talked about in previous meetings. with the City Council and the Planning Commission that the city is required to facilitate and encourage the development of housing for a variety of housing types for special needs groups. The only thing that we are recommending changes is to include the developmentally disabled and make sure that we also touch on the female-headed households and the homeless. These are the special needs groups that are mandated by state law, and the state has been insisting that the city's jurisdictions be more explicit in meeting the requirements of the special needs population. So not just targeting on one or two types of special needs, but all types of special needs. So that's the only change we're recommending. But overall, this, in addition to providing, facilitating housing production, this particular goals and policies also speaks to assistance with home ownership, rental assistance, and also working with other neighboring jurisdictions to address homelessness. Next slide. This one relates to governmental constraints. The housing element is required to mitigate governmental constraints to housing. You're not obligated to mitigate market constraints or environmental constraints, as you have very little control over that. But as a local jurisdiction, you have to mitigate governmental constraints, things that you have the ability to oversee. But we are, again, not suggesting major changes to your to the goals and policies relating to governmental constraints. The only thing that we want to recognize is that you may be using specific plans as a tool to deal with the adequate sites requirement, the rezoning and upzoning that you will be undertaking over the next 3 years. It could be a straight overlay, it could be some kind of rezoning, and it could be also be done through specific plans too. So we want to reflect that potential tool that the city may utilize in achieving adequate sites. Other than that, we are not also recommending any change to your goals and policies when it comes to governmental constraints. Next slide. The next slide is relating to the adequate sites requirement for meeting your regional housing needs allocation. Again, the one change in the goal is to strike down the word residential sites, because this time we are not necessarily focusing on residential sites. We do have to use your non-residential sites to meet your regional housing needs allocation, most likely through an overlay kind of process, but we want to make sure that we accurately reflect your site strategy this time. And because of that, the same reason that we are modifying policy number 3, because policy number 3 was only focusing on the mixed use areas and the residential areas that the city had for the last RHNA cycle, for the 5th cycles of the housing element. As we all know, this time your sites inventory is much more challenging, and meeting the RHNA requires that we do and use primarily an overlay idea, but it's not focusing just on Gardena Boulevard. So we want to again make the policy change to reflect the new site strategy. Other than that, we are not recommending other changes to your goals and policy when it comes to providing adequate sites. You are obligated to do that to meet the regional housing needs allocation, and the whole discussions that we've been having with the city has been having meetings with is how to meet this particular goal and policies. We're not recommending other change other than the fact to reflect that you're using a residential overlay. Next slide. This one looks like we have more of a change, but is actually trying to simplify it a little bit more. In 2017, the state passed AB 686, which really changes the way we look at housing element, we look at sites, we look at the city's obligation when it comes to furthering fair housing. But the fair housing protected classes in your current housing element, it tried to spell out each protected class. from the federal requirement. However, we have to deal with the state fair housing requirements as well, not just the federal fair housing requirements. So this particular policy is being modified and simplified it, so you don't have to update it every time a protected class is added to the fair housing laws. So now it reads affirmatively furthering fair housing for all, regardless of their special characteristics as protected under state and federal fair housing laws. Because if we have to spell out every single protected class, one, there are probably about 15 different protected classes now, and two, they can change anytime. So by rewriting it this way, that we are just continue to be consistent with state law and being compliant with state law. So that's the only reason why we are making this change. To the essence doesn't change, but the wording is simplified. Next slide. So now we go into the more substantial discussions about the changes to the housing element. To the extent possible, we don't want to change your current housing element programs and policies, but a lot of the programs and policies will continue in the city. But since 2017, there's been a lot of laws that change. It governs how the housing element has to be written and how the housing element has to be implemented over time too, once it is adopted. So the first one to deal with rezoning. AB 1397 basically says that you must identify adequate sites to accommodate your lower income, your RHNA for all income groups. You have 3 years from the October 2021 deadline of the housing element to accomplish the rezoning, and either through housing overlay or specific plans, or however the city chooses to do it within the 3 years. But this basically, we will have a program to spell out that the city will implement the rezone program over the next 3 years. The AB 1397 adds on to it some additional requirements. Specifically, it says that if you are rezoning or past the October 2021 deadline to meet your regional housing needs allocation, or if you're reusing sites that you have previously used before, but they continue to be available and you want to use it again for your RHNA, those sites are subject to by right approval if the project includes 20% affordable. And that's a state law, and that we will have to make zoning change in order to, a zoning code amendment in order to recognize this new requirement. But also the Housing Accountability Act has another requirement for the by right. It essentially says that if a housing element designate a site for lower income, then it would receive by right approval regardless of what the zoning or general plan is. So there are like different parts of the law that governs the by right approval, but the project does have to have at least 20% affordable to lower income in order to qualify for that. Next slide.
Veronica, before you move on, to be consistent with our past workshops, this might be a good time to break on each of these slides to discuss if anyone has a question, because
Sure.
it's going to be hard to remember all of this otherwise.
Certainly.
This is Councilman Castin, and I have a question, please. If we can go to the policy 3.5 back.
Sure. We have 3.4.
No, one more up, then forward. No, you went backward, forward. Here we go. Oh, I'm 4.3 then, I'm sorry, not 3.5. Can you explain this for me a little more, please? I mean, I didn't get it. It says we have to encourage the resident development in, I thought that we have other ideas about the Gardena Boulevard.
I think think the previous, the current policy just focuses on Gardena Boulevard. And this one, it includes Gardena Boulevard and probably some other areas. So it's not just within Gardena Boulevard. It would be within the overlay, and the overlay can cover a lot of areas.
Yeah, if I may, you remember, Councilman Kaskanian, that we've been showing you maps that cover Western Avenue and
Yes,
all of those other places. Those are all going to be treated with the residential overlay. So
Yes.
we're just going to update this policy to say encourage residential development in the residential overlays.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions relating to the this first slide of the new programs?
We have two hands from the public. Amanda, can you let one of them in?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and unmute the first member of the public at this time, Isaac.
Hi, thank you, Amanda. My name is Isaac. I represent Equinox Commercial Real Estate at this meeting today. I'm working on a project with the U.S. Bank building in the city of Gardena. It's part of the Pacific Square Plaza, and we're looking at the potential of turning that office building into a multifamily dwelling. And I did see on 4.3 a cross out on any mixed use, and I was just wondering if that would relate to that property as well. Is that just by default based on policy 4.3? Is that option not going to be available because it's part of essentially a mixed use property?
No, the mixed use overlay where it exists will remain. We're adding residential overlays, and some places will have both, but we're not removing any of the mixed use overlays. So those that was a policy from the last housing element, and we're just updating it for this housing element.
And Greg, would that be appropriate then to change this to encourage residential development in the mixed use and residential overlays?
Yeah,
Okay.
because it would still be an option.
Right.
So we'll make that change. Thank you for pointing that out.
Sure. And I do have one more question, if you don't mind. I am looking at 3 different buildings that we represent that have office and office density currently, and they're just completely underperforming. And we have been posed by ownership as to the possibilities of repositioning those spaces, those office spaces, into multifamily. And would this allow for that to happen? I know that's kind of a new subject, but in a shopping center, like let's just say the Tozai Plaza or Seoul Plaza, they have second-story office space, which is just completely empty in some cases. And just wondering if the council sees that as a possibility if we were to engage in that request.
Well, I'm not going to speak for the council, but I will say that on the major shopping centers, we did not include the residential overlay, mostly because they're considered viable for the most part. But if there's second floor residential, that's not something we were aware of when we laid down the overlay. So that's not included in this proposal at this time.
Okay.
And that would be a policy decision that we would have to consider possibly in a subsequent round. It's a little late now, I think.
I think we can, Greg, I think we can open this up for discussion to the council. We don't have to necessarily add it to our sites inventory, because I don't think it will bring us that much, knowing those locations.
Yes, I was just afraid it might be rather short notice for them to consider something that weighty.
I don't think we need it for our site inventory, but I do think, I want the council to be aware they can discuss this. This isn't like a public comment where you can't respond to a member of the public. The purpose of this meeting is in fact to hear what the council has to say about what the public's bringing up as well.
Good point.
And the planning commission. I don't mean to leave my planning commissioners out.
This is Mayor Serta, and I'd just like to comment on this. I was not aware that that space on top was vacant. It's definitely something to look at, that option. I don't know exactly where I stand as far as making it residential yet. I'd like to just look at the pros and cons of this, but I'm always open to hear what's going to be best for an area like that. So I would just be open, again, to doing a little more research into this and seeing the pros and cons of having something like that residential in that area. On the second floor, I'm sorry.
This is Mayor Pro Tem Tanaka, and I kind of agree with that because, parking in that shopping center is the absolute worst. And if you start putting residential in there, how does that impact the businesses down on the bottom? So I think we'd have to look at what the plan would be, because I'm not even sure how many vacants are up there or how that fits, and how many you put 2 bedrooms, 1 bedroom, studios, or what, you'd have to see what kind of a plan it is.
This is Councilman Cascadian. I would like to, I agree with Mayor Pro Tem Tanaka that it is a mess over there as far as the parking. But how can you do a construction while there is a business operating on the bottom portion? So that's what concerns me. And, I think we need to discuss further regarding this. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for your comments. It looks like we have one other member of the public wishing to speak. Let me go ahead and unmute you at this time. One moment. Go.
Hi, this is Josue with also Equinox Commercial Real Estate. So just to piggyback off the conversation we were just having, the Tozai Plaza is a really unique example. But if we were to use, per se, the Sol Plaza, where there is an abundance of parking, where there isn't a lot of drive, and this is, and this relates more to centers that don't have a lot of heavy traffic flow or parking issues. The Tozai Plaza isn't really the best example in the sense of parking and then putting multifamily and et cetera. But if we were to use the Sol Plaza, if we're familiar with that, Isaac and myself, we're in charge of the commercial leasing aspect of it. And the Sol Plaza has an absolute abundance of parking and actually areas that can actually develop multifamily within the lot because it's so big and so large, and the retail isn't fully developed. So that's something that, something for us to consider is Tozai Plaza not really being the ideal scenario, but in plazas that have large amount of parking with, without heavy traffic flow, that we can actually develop property on there. That was one thing. And then regarding the overlay maps, overlay mixed use and residential, is there going to be maps provided to know what area you guys are considering, or how would we be able to identify which areas are and aren't? And when would we know?
Well, if you stick around to the end of the meeting, you'll see them, and then they'll be available on the website afterwards.
Perfect.
And then, of course, they'll be in the housing element whenever it's ready, and that'll be on the website as well.
This is Councilman Henderson. Good evening, all. I just wanted to kind of respond to the developers commercial developers on that. I think it's kind of challenging for us right now as a council to say, yeah or nay, we support or we don't support any type of thing. I think as the mayor said, and all my colleagues have stated, until we kind of can visualize what it looks like, and then we can come up with our own questions and different things that have always been common questions that we've had for any development here. Because, you know, again, how would you have construction for businesses down below? Parking is always an issue, all these different things. So we would have to have some time to kind of synthesize our thoughts and bounce off one another before we can actually give a solid response on, you know, what we like and what we don't like. So I would definitely like to see, as this moves forward, for you to kind of submit something to us for us to discuss.
Absolutely. And I think it's definitely going to depend on site to site scenario, you know, in the sense of if there isn't retail currently, you know, vacant retail on the bottom currently, you know, there wouldn't be that issue, or et cetera. So I just think one policy to cover it all would, you know, I think would be kind of difficult. And I don't know if that's how that works. But if we went from a site to site scenario, depending on the layout and et cetera, I agree 100%, and excited to talk further about that.
I think Mayor and council members, chair and commissioners, what we'd be looking at is to have standards developed in the zoning ordinance, you know, parking requirements, so that if they could not meet the parking, they couldn't convert to residential development. That would pretty much wipe out Tozai Plaza, because I don't think it has adequate parking based on what the uses are right now for the number of restaurants that are there. That's been that way for the decades. I think we can all agree on Tozai. But that would be part of what we'd want to do is come up with basically a general type of zoning ordinance that would cover these things, because we won't have the ability to do it site by site by site. We're only allowed 4 amendments to the land use element per year. So when we go, if you were to say, oh, we'll look at Tozai Plaza and then we'll look at maybe another plaza in 3 months, you can be using up very precious limited resources. But if you come up with overall development standards that say you can do mixed use on a second floor in X, Y, and Z circumstances, then we could handle it in one fell swoop. But they'd have to meet the standards that the Planning Commission recommends and the council imposes.
This is Commissioner Pierce. For a point of record, I think that for the public record and for the recording, the referral to any piece of property within the city is best used by address and not by name, therefore allowing all of the general public that may not know the individual lot by name would recognize it by address. Thank you.
Hoshu, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Perhaps you can just give us the general location of Tozai and Sol Plaza.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tozai Plaza, is an address to go off of is 15460 Western Avenue in Gardena, off the corner of Western and Redondo. The U.S. Bank building is 1600 West Redondo Beach Boulevard in Gardena. And Sol Plaza, give me 1 second, I'll give you an address. And Sol Plaza, 15208 Southwestern Avenue.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we're back on track now. Veronica?
Okay, so the next slide regarding replacement housing requirement, this is also part of AB 1397. Essentially, this is a way to stabilize existing residential neighborhoods and to mitigate displacement. What the state law says is that if you have residential development on a site that currently has residential units, so you're intensifying existing residential uses, then as a condition of project approval, the developer has to provide replacement housing as part of the project in the same income distribution as the units that are being removed. So primarily lower income. So if the site currently has, let's say, 10 units in there, and there are 2 units that are deed restricted as lower income housing, or that they're being occupied by lower income households, then the new project replacing the 10-unit project needs to provide 2 units of affordable housing for lower income households. So that is a new requirement of AB 1397, and the replacement requirements essentially mirrors the state density bonus replacement requirements. That's to make sure that the cities or the development mitigates displacement effect. There are also what we call monitoring of no net loss. So when we do the sites inventory, when we look at the RHNA, I think we've continued to emphasize that the RHNA is a planning goal, is not a production requirement. But however, as sites are being developed, the city has the obligation under SB 166 to make sure that you continue to monitor your ability to accommodate the RHNA should there be development interest. So as a site is being developed, not in the income distribution or not in the number of units as we are assuming in the housing element, you need to make sure that you continue to have the remaining capacity to meet your regional housing needs allocation. And that's the reason why in developing the sites inventory, we are recommended to provide a buffer. So if your RHNA is, your RHNA is, quite extensive, 5,700 units, but the state recommends buffering it for at least like 15 to 30% in order to make sure that as sites are being used for, most likely when sites are being developed at market, they are upper income, they are above moderate income, that you use the sites that's feasible for lower income, for upper income housing, that you continue to have additional or remaining higher density sites that you can meet your lower income RHNA. So it's a kind of like an accounting requirement that you continue to monitor your site inventory. And so the program is to make sure that you develop that monitoring process or procedure within the first year of adopting the housing element. There is also another requirement, SB 330, relating to no net loss as well. That's not really a housing element requirement, but it's more overall citywide general plan. Whether it has, it doesn't have to have anything to do with RHNA, but as you downzone an area, you need to make sure that you also upzone somewhere else. But that requirement is going to sunset in 2025. Next slide. Are there questions on these 2 programs? If not, we'll move to the next slide. There have been a lot of changes to state law relating to special needs housing. And one being AB 139, parking standards for emergency shelters for the homeless. Back in 2007, the state passed SB 2, Housing for the Homeless, that requires jurisdictions to identify a zone where you would allow emergency shelters by right. The city of Gardena has complied with that requirement already, identifying a zone to accommodate potentially an emergency shelters. Again, it's not a requirement that you build the shelter, but you have to make sure that you have a zone that allows that to happen. AB 139 kind of amends the SB 2 from 2007 by saying that everything is fine except that they want you to set the parking standards based on staffing level, not based on number of beds. A lot of times, emergency shelters for the homeless, that zoning. Back when cities were addressing that in 2008 or so, the parking standards were established based on the number of beds in each shelter. But now the state law says establish the parking standards based on the number of staff that you're going to have in at the shelter, if there is one. There is also a new state law relating to supportive housing. Back in 2007, with SB2, when SB2 was adopted or passed, at that time, there was a requirement to address the this provision of supportive housing. This is housing for the disabled that people would be participating in some kind of programs to make sure that they have the ability to go back to independent living. And so the city of Gardena again has addressed the SB2 requirement of supportive housing. In 2019, they passed 2162, AB 2162, that's amending that law again to address supportive housing for the homeless. And this is actually the type of supportive housing that has to meet very, very specific criteria, very extensive specific criteria that says if you meet these criteria, they need to be allowed in residential and mixed use zones. But the criteria are pretty extensive. I think there are additional like 10 different requirements that you have to meet in order to meet the requirements of AB 2162, requiring that to be permitted in multifamily and mixed use zones. Then the next one is actually health and
Veronica?
safety. Yes.
I'm sorry, we do have a question from the city manager.
Sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to, for a point of record, Councilwoman Francis has been on since earlier. She was having technical difficulties. She's on now and she can hear and see fine now. So I just want to welcome Councilwoman Francis to the meeting.
Oh, okay. So then not specific question to this slide.
No, sorry.
Okay. Then there is the health and safety code relating to employee housing. This is actually not new state law. This has been in existence for probably many, many, many years. However, the state has been now paying attention to that and making sure jurisdictions fix the zoning code to address employee housing. What the health and safety code essentially says, a housing unit that is used to accommodate 6 or fewer employees, any kind of employees, like if it's a company provided housing, essentially, then it's considered a regular residential use, a single family residential use. So you have to address that in your zoning code, but this is a requirement that's been in place probably for decades. The next set of requirements relates to accessory dwelling units. Again, in the last 3 years or so, the state has passed a lot of different bills relaxing the development of accessory dwelling units in local jurisdictions. But AB 68 specifically deals with the housing element. Within the housing element, we must facilitate the development of ADUs in your community. And you have to identify incentives that you can use to facilitate that. And some of the incentives, and it's not all required, but some of the suggested incentives used by other jurisdictions include pre-approved plans. That would save the cost of property owners because they don't have to hire somebody to draw up the plans. They can just use the ones that the city has pre-approved, and that would also help the city in getting the type and design of ADUs that it feels appropriate in the community. Streamlining the review and processing of ADUs, reducing fees for ADUs, providing technical assistance. There are also, you can also look at eliminating the requirement for architectural matching if the ADU cannot be seen from the street. Another incentive could be allowing ADUs larger than 1,200 square feet, but you can do that with discretionary permit. So these are some of the incentives that the city could consider, and we'll certainly work with the staff in the city to identify the specific ones that may be appropriate to the city.
Veronica, I have a question. Is there any guidance from HCD how many incentives a city should put in their housing element?
There are not so much guidance in terms of how many, but it depends on how aggressive your ADU strategy is. Like, for example, if some jurisdiction, they are really pushing to use ADUs to meet the RHNA, and their projections are much higher than the trend that they can demonstrate currently, then you would need to substantially, I would say, beef up your incentives. Otherwise, it would be difficult to justify the inflated trend. But if you are using a relatively moderate or conservative plan for your ADUs to meet your regional housing needs allocation requirement, then I would say 2 or 3 would be adequate.
Veronica, if I can just point out a couple of things. One, for the reduced fees, what we were about there is reduced fees when somebody agrees to make it a lower income unit with an affordable type housing agreement, not for somebody who's going to build an ADU and then rent it out at market rate. And then for allowing larger ADUs, which would be between 1,001 and 1,200 square feet, Gardena used to allow ADUs at 1,200 square feet. When the law was changed, I don't know, last year, the year before, and they said we could, clarified we could go down. We did, so that I think it's 850 if it's smaller than if it's a 1 bedroom or less, and it can be 1,000 if it's 2 or more bedrooms. But there has been interest in going, people doing more than 1,200 square feet, and you could allow that back again by a discretionary permit, so that the Planning Commission could make sure that it fit in with the site. And I think we may want some input from the council, because we certainly don't want to put incentives into the document that the council doesn't want. And the commission. If anyone has anything to say.
Well, what are the standard and usual number, and what are they? And where did we get these from?
What are you talking about, square footage?
Yeah.
Or so state law used to reference a 1,200 square foot ADU, and they still say if the city doesn't have its own standards, then you have to allow up to 1,200 square feet ADU. And as I said, up until I think 2019, when we adopted the urgency ADU ordinance in December, Gardena allowed 1,200 square feet. State law was changed, and I guess it must have been around in the 2019 legislation that they changed it, or they clarified it, that said if you had your own ordinance, you could go down to the 850 and then 1,000 if it was 2 or more units. And that had to be, that's a by right approval. ADUs are ministerial approvals. You can't have any discretionary review on them. So.
You mean 2 or more bedrooms, not units?
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Greg, for clarifying that. So that a suggestion, and I know what some of the cities that we represent have done, has said, if you want to go between that 1,000 and 1,200 square feet, we can go back to a discretionary permit for that, as long as we're still allowing the other ones by right. But the numbers came out of the 2019 housing legislation.
And these incentives that are under this AB 68, those are put out by the state?
No, they're just suggestions. They're what other cities are doing. Veronica can speak to them. I think HCD has bought off on these types of incentives for ADUs. In all honesty, if most of our ADUs are garage conversions, the pre-approved site and floor plans don't work too well, but we can still offer that if somebody has somewhere to put it on their lot that isn't a garage conversion.
Okay.
Lisa, I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I overtalked on Mayor Pro Tem. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's right.
In my understanding, I thought it was garage conversion as of considered ADU. And if somebody going to build additional structure, that's considered a second unit, isn't it, on a property?
No. Residential unit of 850 or the 1,000 square feet for an ADU can be attached or it can be detached. So it can be a new attached structure, or it can be a new detached structure, or it can be conversion of existing structure, such as a pool room or a garage, or I don't know, if somebody had, let's say, a workshop out back that they wanted to convert.
I see. So if I own a house, let's say it's like 1,000 square feet, and my lot is a pretty good size, and I build 1,200 square feet structure in the back, bigger than the original house, that will be still considered a ADU.
Right now, the ADU could only be up to 1,000 square feet. However, I do think we put a provision in our ordinance that was different from what other cities had done when worked with Ray on this, that said you could petition to allow the other unit to become your main unit, if it meant all the development standards. So if, let's say you had 1,000 square foot home with 2 bedrooms in it, so it would meet your ADU standards, you could do 1,200 square feet and call that your main residence.
Because
that would be a discretionary permit again, because then you're building more than the 1,000 square
than the
feet.
original. Yeah, because I have a cousin build a secondary, I mean, I would say ADU, but that's why they started. Their house was 1,100 some square feet, and they were going to do 1,200. The city of Covina did not allow them to do it because it was more than the original structure that it was on the property. So they had to do smaller as a square footage than the original house.
I am not going to comment on what another city or another city attorney has advised
Yeah, but-
without everything before me. But
But
that's, I know that HCD says you can't limit it to the percent. So let's say you had 1,000 square foot house and you said your ADU can only be 50% of the size of the primary structure. HCD has said that would be 500 square feet, but HCD has said you still have to allow that at least 850 or 1,000 square feet.
I see.
So,
Okay.
but it sounds
Well,
like if this was going to be bigger and it was over the 1,000 square feet that was allowed, and if that's the city's ordinance, then it sounds like the city was correct. But again, without having all the facts.
Well, what I'm getting to is that, maybe we have to put a limit to us as far as the city, in my opinion, that, we should not allow them to do, whatever the numbers are, the max that we decide. So, otherwise the people will build on it, and guess what? They'll sell the property. Oh, we have 2 units on the property, front house, back house, so, and then it's going to lead us to somewhere else. Then the people, they're going to start building and selling. So I don't know. Some people will take an advantage. That's why,
I have a question.
Yes.
So according to this law, did I hear correctly that the ADUs would count toward our arena numbers?
Veronica?
Yes, you could, but it's based on trend. It's not based on capacity. So you cannot say because I have 1,000 parcels that could put in an ADU, therefore I can have 1,000 ADUs over the next 8 years. It specifically allows us only to count based on your trend between 2018 and 2020. So if you are averaging about 10 units a year or 20 units a year, you can project your new trend to be 80 or 120 units over 8 years for your arena. And if you want to project more aggressively, then you will have to put in a lot more incentives to justify that.
I have one more question, please. So should our square footage for ADUs, should that match what we've established for other developments? Was it 900 square feet for a 3-bedroom, 800 for a 2-bedroom? Does the state law allow us to match? You understand my question?
No, state law says that somebody can build as small as 150 square feet. So we can't put our minimum size on them. And we don't really have a maximum size in our code. Our code goes to minimum size requirement.
The minimum.
And we can't require a minimum size for the ADUs. All we can do is establish that 850 square feet for studio 1-bedroom and 1,000 square feet for the 2 bedrooms. 2+ bedrooms, 2, 3, 4, whatever.
So the ADUs don't need to be consistent with requirements, the minimum requirements for other developments.
That's correct, not for ADUs.
Oh. And we can't make it that way, or according to state law, we can't have to leave it like it is.
That state law preempts, even charter cities are preempted.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So any more questions on this slide? If not, we'll move to the next slide. This is the one of the most significant requirements passed in 2017, AB 686, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing, which requires that when we update the housing element, we also looked at the site inventory and also the city's existing conditions from the lens of equity, and also the distribution of the sites, essentially, that you do not over concentrate development in a particular neighborhood. And so what we need to do after the site inventory is established by the city council, once you and planning commission, once you have agreed to a select set of sites that we can use, we have to do analysis from a variety of perspectives, and then also looked at what are the meaningful actions that the city can take to promote housing mobility, allowing people the choices to move, to have the options to move within the city. And there are choices in terms of housing type, there are choices in terms of income, housing affordability. How do we improve neighborhoods that are currently maybe in a situation where it does have over-concentration of overcrowding or cost burden or housing conditions issues? How do you do neighborhood improvement in a way that target those neighborhoods so that the quality of housing is improved and the quality of the neighborhoods are improved? We also need to look at anti-displacement strategies, what the city can do to stabilize some of the neighborhoods. As we mentioned before, one of the replacement requirement programs that we talked about is an anti-displacement strategy. But are there any other city actions that are considered to be stabilizing neighborhoods? And specifically, the city of Gardena has rent stabilization among your mobile home parks, and you have like mobile home rent mediation. So those can be considered as stabilizing actions to address affordability and displacement issues. So that is a new requirement, and we have to outline the city's efforts in that area. Are there questions on this one? If not, I believe that's the end of the housing. Oh, no, actually, I have more. Yeah. So the next slides relates to some of the kind of newer ideas about providing housing. The first one we get relating to housing on religious facility properties. AB 1851 is law already that if a nonprofit partners with a religious facility operator or a church to provide on-site affordable housing, the city is required to provide parking relief. And so this is something in state law. The city probably needs to either do some kind of an overlay. We have seen a lot of interest by nonprofits to do affordable housing, to partner with affordable housing, to partner with churches to provide affordable housing. This is actually a pretty significant trend statewide. The housing element also is required to provide affordable housing incentives. How do you facilitate affordable housing in your community? And definitely providing financial assistance or gap financing is probably the most significant or feasible options that nonprofits are looking for. The city of Gardena has home funds, CDBG funds, and you also have allocation from the permanent local housing allocation that can be used for affordable housing. Partnering with nonprofits is important. A lot of the times, nonprofits or developers that are providing affordable housing are looking for reduced or waived or deferred fees. And I think it just depends on the city's financial situation. A lot of the jurisdictions may not be waived or reduced fees, but if you defer fees until permit issuance to some, that's also a great help to affordable housing. expediting processing is always identified as an important incentive, and also providing flexibility in development standards to allow a project to maximize the use of sites. So those are some of the incentives that jurisdictions have used before, and again, we certainly welcome the Planning Commission and City Council's comment on which are the ones that you think should be included in the housing element. We are doing a lot of rezoning and upzoning in the city of Gardena in order to meet your very large a challenging RHNA. And a lot of times what we have heard from local jurisdictions is how do you explore that? How do you recapture some of that value for upzoning in order to provide for affordable housing? So this is something that the city may be able to may explore in trying to incorporate community benefits in the housing overlay, so that you in addition to providing for housing, for the opportunity to build, you're also providing some benefits to the existing residents through community benefits, like a provision of, a lot of times it would be like childcare facilities, community meeting rooms, community open space. That type of community benefits have been used by a lot of jurisdictions in order to compensate for the increased value that comes with upzoning. Any comments on this? Okay. So the next one is certainly another way to provide for affordable housing is inclusionary housing. This is something that is important to some jurisdictions, especially when we think about the no net loss requirement we talked about, the SB 1626 no net loss, that as sites are being used and they are being developed, but they're not developed with affordable housing, or then you need to replenish your site's inventory, or make sure that your site's inventory have enough buffer to replenish to continue to meet your regional housing needs allocation. So a lot of communities don't have the luxury of having a lot of buffer in their site's inventory. So one way to deal with the no net loss is through inclusionary, that at least for every 100 units you build, you get 15 affordable units out of it. So a lot of jurisdictions are considering inclusionary right now. The state passed a law, I think also in 2017, that if an inclusionary housing program does not exceed 15%, then it's considered a legitimate local policy, a discretionary decision. You don't need to establish the causal relationship between market rate housing and affordable housing. But you do have to have in lieu options if a developer cannot, for some reason, provide the affordable housing on site. They have a way to meet the regional house, the inclusionary requirement with some in lieu options. In lieu options typically would be off-site construction, donation of land, or payment of a fee. But all that inclusionary has to come hand in hand with the density bonus. If they're required to provide the affordable housing, then they're eligible for the density bonus. The state has made it very clear with, again, changes in 2017 that the inclusionary policy must be consistent with the state density bonus law. Certainly the next option for facilitating affordable housing is using city-owned properties. The city does have some city-owned properties, but it's up to the city whether you would consider that as a surplus site and be able to provide that for affordable housing. Most of the times jurisdictions do go to this strategy of using city-owned properties, but only provide that for, you have to require either affordable housing or mixed income housing on city-owned properties. But that's a strategy that the city may consider in the future. You don't necessarily have to establish that right now. So those are some of the suggestions. Some of the programs are required, I think, and some of the programs when it comes to facilitating affordable housing are just options that you may want to consider. But all the ones that relating to state law are required programs. Is there any question on this one?
Or comment?
Yeah.
A quick question. You said some of the housing programs are required by state law.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Which ones were that? Was that the?
If we go back to the slide, slide number 9, housing programs, new state laws. Number 9, slide number 9, slide number 10, slide number 11. And 12. Those are all required new programs. But 13 onwards are just considerations.
Okay. All right, thank you.
If there are no questions or comments on this slide, then I think the next, we will move on to the next segment of the presentation on sites.
Okay. For those of you who have not been through this already, we're going to break the city into segments, starting at the north and working our way to the south. So let's start with the first map. Okay. This is the northern part of the city, north of Rosecrans up to El Segundo, from Crenshaw to Vermont. And let's start with the first changes. This is, by the way, reflective of every change so far. The parts in yellow were changes that were recommended by the Planning Commission. And I'm not really going to go into each one because I think by now everybody has seen them, but if you have questions, by all means interrupt and ask. The next set of changes were recommendations from the City Council. Now these haven't been seen by the public yet, so I will point out that up on the northern part of the city where El Segundo Boulevard is, we did remove our hypocrisy and we did downzone this area. We just basically removed the overlay there because it was abutting the backyards of R1 properties. And then on Van Ness Avenue, we removed those properties at the request of the mayor. And except for the ones on the left side, I think we just downzoned those because they were already, is that right? Does anybody remember?
I think we downzoned those.
Yeah. And then on Rosecrans, the red square is no longer considered feasible because it's adjacent to the trash sorting place. And then staff made a few additional reductions. Basically, that piece down on the bottom. The only bit left was on the far west side, but it turns out that I already had the mixed use overlay anyway, so there was no point in connecting with all of those to the middle section were considered infeasible. So there was no point in having them in there anymore. So we just took all of that area out. So those are the changes that we've made since the City Council meeting. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or anybody want to redo? Okay, let's move on to the next section then. All right, now we're going to go from Redondo Beach Boulevard up to Rosecrans. By the way, we try to capture as many of the religious institutions as we can in all of these maps. You'll see them as orange with a blue outline. Okay, so let's start with the Planning Commission changes. All right, this was moved up to the 06 overlay to match the other side of the street. All right. The consensus, as far as we could tell from the city council, was not to do 06 on this portion of Crenshaw. So we pushed that down, and we decided that the most appropriate was probably 04. And any staff changes? Yeah, we made a few tweaks here just to be consistent with what we were doing on the other areas. Okay, any questions here? All right then. Yes.
They're on Crenshaw Boulevard.
Mhm.
That's we're not doing that.
No, we're doing it, but we're going to do it with an 04 overlay. It's just less density in this area. These areas abut for the most part to the backyards of people who have the R1s. And so we didn't want to put the heavy density there.
Yeah, because remember that there's no channel right there. That's why they didn't have a
Yeah.
buffer between the high density locations like they do up on the northern side where there's the channel, so they got some space.
We're sort of like what's going on behind the car wash on Rosecrans. Because you have the residential on one side, and then the new place that's going in.
Right, we took the overlay off of that area.
Right, but it would be the same density, Councilmember Francis, at the 20 to 30 DU per acre is the same as what the mixed use overlay is.
So it'd be the same here as it is over here? Or
Yeah.
no? It
Yeah.
would be.
It would just be the same density in those two areas.
As it is on Rosecrans.
On that section of Rosecrans, yes. The part that's pink.
Like this pink, right in there? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's move on then. Now we'll cover this section from Redondo Beach Boulevard down to roughly about where Gardena Boulevard is. First, it looks like only staff corrections were made here. Is that correct, Amanda?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The one in the middle, it was if I'm not mistaken, that was made at a property owner's request. We just added that one in because there was some interest in developing that one with residential uses. And the other one at the top of Western, I think was, I don't remember why we made that change. Do you remember, anyone?
No.
I think it was just, yeah, for consistency, that those properties also hit along Western with the mixed use overlay. So we allowed the housing overlay with the higher density.
Okay. So that was just to make it match most of Western then.
That's correct.
That's that, and adding more churches is all we really did here.
Yeah. And I'd want to point out that this area here is the Pacific Square Center, and I believe the members of the public who spoke earlier, that's those, it was one of the properties that they had, they were speaking in regards to. So we had other inquiries from property owners in that area for potential housing development. So we included it in part of the overlay.
Those are the gentlemen that have the developers that are looking at that the bank, correct?
Correct.
So am I to think that now that they're considering that, I know at one time the property owner was talking about subdividing that entire lot. So is he going to start selling little lots to build houses?
No, I thought they were looking to actually convert the existing office building into residential uses, not build individual lots there.
Okay, because the new owners of that entire lot were trying to subdivide that.
I do remember that.
Yeah, they were going to subdivide it to 3 parcels, and that's why they were going to build it.
Okay. Well, we haven't spoken to them in any detail, so we've marked it as not included in the inventory.
So did we grant it to them? Not granted, I mean, did we agree with them to change the particular zoning on that particular property? Did we say yes to them?
Well, we're not changing the zoning, we're just adding an overlay. And yes, it was at their request.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions?
You're not including this part, the part with the green square around it, that's not being included?
No, it will be included in the overlay, but we're not including it in the sites inventory for the housing element.
And for what reason again?
Well, we're taking a conservative approach with the housing element. We're only putting forth the most viable and likely candidates. So all of those with the hash marks on them are not going to be included because they're probably going to get extra scrutiny and it's not really worth it. So we have enough sites without those.
Why would they get extra scrutiny? I'm just kind of
Because it's a commercial center with multiple tenants and a bank building. It's HCD will probably look sideways at it and say, I don't think so. So rather than go through that, we'll just leave it out and move on to the next one. But if it does have any potential, we'd like to have it in the overlay.
And eventually count towards our allocation.
Okay, next slide then. All right, now we're going from Gardena Boulevard down to Artesia Boulevard. The changes here from the PC were right there on Normandy. We were originally going in with an 06, and now we were talked down to an 04 in that area. That's, what's that cross street? I don't remember what that one is.
That's 166 on the north side.
Yeah, thank you.
Down to 170th, yeah.
Okay. So we downs that overlay to 04. And then anything from the council on this one? No. Staff made a few changes. In the upper left, we just, for consistency, we just took in some more of the commercial that was overlooked. That was probably just an oversight. We took out the Zentus site in the middle, as we are expecting to get a specific plan proposal on that one now. So there's no sense in including it because it's going to be developed in a different way probably. And in the upper right, it just was like an island that didn't make much sense all by itself. So we took that out too.
Greg, I believe we took out some other properties on Normandy as well.
You're right, we did. We took out some of the one, yes, right there, that are, and a little bit to the south too.
Because we determined, because the specific plan is most likely coming in on Normandy, that actually, I think the area that the PC marked, we talked about taking that out altogether because we were going to put it all onto the Zentus site. So we may want to take a relook at that one site now that I'm looking at it again.
I think that if and when they make their application, might reconsider this whole area because it may just be too much, just too much for that of a burden for that area with all the railroad crossings and everything. But are there any questions on this slide? Okay, then let's move on to the last one. This is the southern portion. So we'll start with Planning Commission. Have anything? Yeah, we made this change more from the request of the public that attended the Planning Commission workshop. Rather than a rezoning as we had originally intended here, we've decided to do an overlay. So the zones that are out there will remain, and all of the benefits that those people enjoy having the unusual zone that they have, which is an industrial/residential zone, will stay. But we're proposing I think that's an 03 overlay on that. Is
Correct.
that?
That's correct.
Okay, so that will allow for up to 17 units to the acre, and there are a few properties in there that could benefit from that, but for the most part, most of them are marked as infeasible due to their size. And were there any other changes here? No?
No.
Okay. So those are the sum of all of the changes that we've made through the two previous workshops, and this is what we're proposing to include in the housing element that gets sent to the state, unless there's any last minute or additional changes requested. And this would be the time to make those. Okay, then this is what we're planning on.
Actually, I do have one question.
Okay,
To staff. So we got our RENA number, and you know, we're making our effort to meet the goal. Who determines our progress and everything in regards to that, as far as our deliberate speed in getting this housing built? Are we going to get assessed every year, or just progress? Or what if nobody comes and wants to build anything? Will we be penalized?
Welcome to 2021 legislation. Veronica can probably speak more to this than I can, but I know the state's looking at hundreds of additional housing laws, and I think some of them will address what the city will have to do if it's not making its progress. And Veronica, anything else you can do this?
Let me add on to that. There are currently already a couple of requirements. One, you're required to annually report your progress in meeting your RENA, and part of that requirement is to look at meticulously reporting on how quickly are you reviewing and approving projects. So almost application by application, you have to tell them when the application came in, how long did it take for you to approve it, how long does it take for the project to be permitted. So exactly which jurisdiction they're going to pick on in terms of monitoring that, we don't know that, but we do know that in 2-3 weeks, the state is going to pass the budget. If the budget is passed as proposed, there is a 12 member division. There's budget to increase the HCD or expand the state's ability to monitor by adding a division that has 12 staff positions on monitoring. So far, they've been monitoring on a reactive basis. If you're being complained by somebody and say you're not doing things right, then they'll monitor you in a more reactive basis. But with this new budget and new division, they'll be able to do more proactive monitoring. That's one thing. The second thing is SB 35. SB 35 was passed quite a few years ago. But what it does is that in the 4th year of your 8-year planning cycle, they will go in, the state will go in and look at your progress in building units. If you're not meeting half of your RENA by the midterm of the 8-year cycle, you will be identified as a jurisdiction that's eligible for SB 35 processing. SB 35 processing is streamlined by right approval if the project is able to meet certain conditions. So that's another kind of quote unquote penalty. But like Lisa is talking about, they're thinking about more certainly.
Right. So here's a gap we're facing now. So we already have a backlog of things we're doing in our community development already in existence. And then now we're going to be levied with a criterion of what a proper turnaround time is. So if it's physically not possible due to staffing or whatever, where do we have that discussion about we can't meet the criteria, not because we don't want to, we're just unable to because we're already behind in some of the things that we're trying to do in the development. One, and second, because we don't control when people decide to come build, how is that our issue?
Veronica?
Yeah, I think this thing is still the bottom line is still not a requirement that you build. It's still not an obligation to build. So far with all the penalties, it's still not requiring the cities to build. So I don't know whether there'll be more in the future, but that's where the housing elements is so heavily focused this time on removing governmental constraints, streamlining processes, and providing additional capacity. But at this point, it's still not an obligation. Even SB 35 is not saying that you will, you're being penalized, punished for not production, but you're being identified as the jurisdictions that a development meeting certain criteria would be eligible for streamlined processing.
Thank you for that. So Lisa, let me ask this. I got one more question. So let's say nobody wants to develop any housing, but somebody decides they wanted to build a boutique hotel and everything, and we want to support that, and any development we can get is helpful. Well, the state say, well, you aren't developing any housing, but we're going to slow up your role on the development of your hotel and everything like that. So then do we have to go to court for that? Because again, somebody wants to come develop a hotel, but nobody wants to come develop a housing development.
As long as let's say that the hotel site has an overlay on it. When we develop the commercial or industrial property according to the original zoning, the underlying zoning, we're going to have to be doing that inventory that Veronica talked about in the beginning to say there's still adequate sites available to meet our RHNA and all the different income levels. As long as we can make that finding, I don't see a basis for anybody to bring a lawsuit, certainly not the state on that. Even if we couldn't make, even if you couldn't make that finding, you have 6 months to rezone additional properties if you can no longer meet your RHNA. So I don't see the state coming in as long as we're compliant with our housing element and stopping any other type of development. They're going after the cities who are being really bad actors, who are denying projects, which are projects that should be approved by right, and throwing up all sorts of impediments or not following the state laws.
Thank you for that. And then I got one more, but it's probably, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. When you look at some of the numbers of the development, and we all want affordable housing where we can get it, but the numbers don't work for the developer and thus they won't develop. Is there something, maybe Veronica, you can respond to this, is there some other funding that the state is providing local jurisdictions to help, I don't want to say subsidize, but help us offset some of those costs that make sure we get some affordable housing?
Yeah, and that's one thing. Is the first one is the SB2, the permanent local housing allocation. It's not a significant amount right now, and I have to double check how much Gardena is eligible to receive, but it's funding that you would receive as an entitlement, kind of similar to your CDBG, that as long as you apply for it, you're entitled to receive it and can be used for affordable housing. But there are certainly a lot more affordable housing funding programs that are being explored or generated right now with new legislation. Having the housing element certified by the state certainly opens up your eligibility for a lot more of those. For example, the most typical affordable housing funding program is low-income housing tax credit, and the sustainable communities and affordable housing Act, that those two are some of the key programs. If you don't have a housing element that's certified by the state, you will not be competitive. Either the city will not be competitive, or the nonprofit who is trying to get funding to build projects in the city would not be competitive in for those funds. So having the housing element certifiable by the state is very important for a nonprofit to access those funding.
Okay, thank you. I'm done with my questions. I'm good now.
Veronica, going back to Councilman Henderson's first question on the punishments for not keeping up with the RENA, you mentioned that streamlining could be imposed on the city. Can you define what that means?
With SB 35, this one is that if you are identified as an eligible city to offer SB 35, then this SB 35 is very prescribed under state law that you have only certain amount of time to respond to an application if they meet the standards. If they meet your general plan, if they meet your zoning, if they meet your development standards, then you have very specific time frame to respond, and has to be a ministerial approval. But SB 35 is not as big of an issue in Southern California because of the criteria that you have to meet. There are 17 different criteria that a project has to meet, and it's very difficult for communities in Southern California to meet that. One being that it has to provide prevailing wage for the entire project, and it makes there are very few SB 35 projects being processed in Southern California. So I think even though the punishment is there, the reality is probably very limited.
Thank you. And I will point out also that all of our housing, for the most part, is ministerial already. So
right.
There's not much of a threat there.
Right.
Veronica, will we still be allowed to do the site plan review on top of the ministerial?
I think you can do site plan review, but what I've always heard HCD state is that you can do site plan review as long as there are objective standards, and that the density and the use are not part of the review.
And the objective standards are state law now under
right.
various other provisions in any event.
So how does SB 9 affect us?
I'm sorry, what's SB 9, council member?
That's
the single family neighborhoods should be allowed to add additional units.
Oh.
That just got passed, I think.
Did it?
I haven't heard that yet, so.
I haven't either. It may have made it out of a committee, but I don't think.
But streamlining the process was just one of the requirements. I was trying to find the others in my notes. Weren't there others that were included?
I think if I can go back 1 second to Councilmember Tanaka, it just passed out of committee, but that was it.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Francis, could you repeat your question? I was lagging behind as I was trying. You're muted. Councilmember.
Oh, no problem. I was just saying, because I know Ms. McLean mentioned streamline as one of the requirements, but weren't there others just beside, there was a whole list of things I didn't get in my notes.
Yeah. Are you talking about on the PowerPoint presentation that we did?
Yes, he mentioned.
I think she means when a city is failing to keep up with its numbers at the halfway point.
Veronica?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Veronica, you'd mentioned that the state will monitor the cities at the 4-year mark, and those that are not producing half of their RENA will be put on a list and possibly punished.
No, I'm not punished. They will be put on the list for the eligibility for SB 35 processing, which we both and I just mentioned. That is not a big threat to the city. One, because it's very difficult to meet the requirements in Southern California. And two, the city does ministerial processing for a lot of the projects anyway. So it's not that big of a difference to the city.
So the question was, are there any other consequences?
For not producing, at this time, no.
Okay. Perhaps, Councilmember Francis, you were thinking of there are several serious consequences for not having a housing element adopted.
No, I wasn't. Actually, I'm just a little confused because on one hand, we say that the housing element is not an obligation to production, but then in 4 or 5 years, the state's going to come in and take a look at what progress we're making. If we're not making progress, then there are consequences. So I guess it's kind of confusing to me. How can at one point you say we're not obligated, but then on the other hand, we're going to come back in about 5 years and see, you know, what your progress, start checking your progress. I guess that's what's confusing to me. And how do we reconcile that as a city?
I think the requirement is that you facilitate the production of housing, so that you remove all the roadblocks for housing production. And if you've done that, you've done your job, and housing doesn't come, you know. And I always use the same example, like back in the 4th cycle. Once the housing element was adopted, we went into a recession. Nothing gets built. And so there's no, like, you can't control that. And so there's no consequence to that. So this monitoring by the state in the midterm is only to make sure that if housing is not if you're not producing the affordable housing, then they want to make it easier for a developer to get through with the streamlined processing. But again, just like Greg mentioned, that is a statewide policy, but it really has very limited difference or impact to Gardena, because you already provide like ministerial approval for a lot of the housing anyway.
Okay, are there any other questions? We're at the end of our presentation.
This presentation will be posted on the city's housing element link on the website, so everybody can go back and take a look at it, or anybody who's interested in it and didn't get to participate tonight, it will be up there.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much for putting this presentation together. It was very informative, and we had a lot of really great discussion going on here tonight. So at this time, the Gardena City Council will adjourn to the study session meeting of the City Council at 5 p.m., followed by the special closed session at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 3rd, 2021. And the Planning and Environmental Quality Commission will adjourn to the regular scheduled Planning Commission meeting at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, June 15th, 2021. So we are adjourned at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for attending.
Yes,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Tam.
Welcome.